This lecture will be on Korea, the United States, and Japan from 1910 to 1945. Now, as before, we will consider the periodization of this time period. Now, one thing we want to note that's kind of odd about this time period is that Korea, remember, was annexed by Japan in 1910, and in fact, the United States and Korea had ended official diplomatic relations back in 1905 with the forced signing of the Protectorate Treaty. So, in a sense, official relations between the United States and Korea are over. And of course, in 1910, Korea ceases to exist as an independent country. However, there are still Americans in Korea and Koreans in America. And we're thinking about the United States and Korea broadly. So the fact that official relations are now over doesn't mean that there's not interaction. It doesn't mean that things are not going on. In fact, as we will see, a lot is going on between the Americans and Koreans during this time period. Now, broadly speaking, we can divide this period into three. And you can see how important Japan is because all three periods that we divide this into tend to emphasize Japanese government action, right? So, in a sense, what really affects what's going on in Korea is what the Japanese government is up to. So from 1910 to 1919, this is usually referred to as the period of military rule. I'll talk more about what that is and why later, but basically that's kind of one of the harsher periods of the colonial period in Korea, where basically the Japanese military is in charge of the peninsula and tries to run Korea as if it was the army. Then, because of the March 1st movement, which was kind of this nationwide protest against that harshness and for Korean independence, Japan will switch to what is called the period of cultural rule. And this is actually a term they use. They talked about cultural rule, where they tried to move away from this kind of harsher military style rule and gave Koreans some limited freedom. However, in many ways, they still were able to control Koreans and limit through things like censorship what Koreans could say and what Koreans could do. So it's a time of greater freedom than the military rule period, but not that much. Now, we could either start this next period in either 31 or 37. For our sake, that's not so important. But basically in the 30s and into the 1940s, you have increasing militarism in Japan. Right, 1931, Japan will seize Manchuria from China. 1937, it will launch a full-scale invasion of China, and that leads to some very, very harsh conditions in Korea. Right, that leads to some very harsh conditions in Korea. This is when Koreans are forced to change their names, for example, to Japanese names. This is when there's an attempt to forbid Koreans from speaking Korean, insisting they speak Japanese, and things like that. Of these two periods, this is the one that probably actually has the least amount of research opportunities for us, because this is when Japan is really closing off from the West. In those first two periods of time, Japan is very concerned, right? Between 1910 and 1931, Japan is very concerned with what people in the West think about Korea, and that's when it's willing to interact more, and there's more freedom for Koreans to kind of interact, and that's when you're going to see more of that American interaction. But as militarism increases, there's less and less of that because the Japanese really don't care what Americans or other Westerners think, and they close off access. There's still a few things you can do there, but it's really that period from 1910 to 1931 where you're going to see more opportunities to do papers. So starting in 1910, like I said, there's this Japan annexes Korea, and it establishes what we call the period of military rule. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, the official name of the colonial government of Japan in Korea is the Government General, right? The Government General. And the Government General is headed by a Governor General. And the Governor General is basically like dictator of Korea, and he is directly responsible to the Japanese emperor. He's not responsible to the Prime Minister of Japan or to the Diet of Japan. He's responsible directly to the emperor. So he's basically this very, very powerful dictator. And every single Governor General served in the military. Some were active duty, some were no longer active duty, but every single one of them had served in the military. All of them except for one was in the army. The one Navy man was brought in as part of the cultural rule policy. The Navy was usually considered a bit more liberal than the Army, and that's why he was connected there. But Army, Navy, every man, and they were all men, who served in this position was from the military. As I said, they were appointed by the emperor, and they established basically this was a centralized government with essentially a dictator at its head who had the power to appoint local officials down to the village level. And this was any kind of reforms that they brought in, any kind of changes they wanted to be made, were enforced by a powerful police force with summary powers. So, for example, the police, especially with minor issues, could act as both a police officer and as the judge and jury, right? A police officer was allowed to basically punish you then and there if you did something wrong, right? They wouldn't necessarily have to arrest you in order to and bring you to trial to punish you. A police officer could just punish you straight out. And this led to huge amounts of abuse. The police were often able to attack and beat up people whenever they wanted. There wasn't really a whole lot that could be done about it. And one thing I do want to point out was that about half the police force was actually made up of Koreans who were working for the Japanese. And this is going to will be one reason you're going to have massive divisions later on after Korea becomes liberated, is what do you do with these people, right, who worked for the Japanese and could be quite cruel. But in any case, this new government is based around the military, is going to bring massive, rapid changes to Korea. Right, so Korea is going to have that was already going through some change, right? But it's going to be really accelerated, right? So they're going to be transforming, in a sense, Korea into what looks more like modern Japan. Now, what's going to happen is we call this colonial modernity, right? So becoming modern, if you've taken my other classes, you may remember, especially world history, I talk about being modern means undertaking a political, economic, scientific, and industrial revolution, right? So it changes your politics, it changes your society, it changes your economy, it changes everything. And that's one thing that Japan had been able to do that made it so powerful, was it undertook those kind of modernizing reforms. It undertook revolutions, political, social, economic, industrial, scientific, so forth. Colonial modernity refers to this happening when you are colonized by someone else. And so what happens is that being modern means becoming like the people who are colonizing you, right? So you can imagine how this could lead to some difficult kind of feelings, because imagine a bully beating you up, and then the bully says, see, I beat you up because you're weak, and if you want to be strong, you got to be like me. You got to become like the people who are oppressing you, right? That's what makes colonial modernity so difficult, right? Is the people who came in and took us over, they were stronger. They could take us over. They can do what they want to us. And it seems like the only way for us to become more powerful is to become like them, right? That's the challenge of colonial modernity. It connects being modern with the people you see as your oppressor. And it says to become modern is to become like your oppressor, but then what happens to you in the process? If being Korean is what got us into trouble and allowed the Japanese to take over, then being like we need to become like the Japanese to become stronger. But how can we become like the Japanese and still stay Korean? Right? That's a fundamental problem that Koreans are facing during this time period. Right? So just keep in mind, right, if you're Korean living this time period, you're living what is essentially a dictatorship where Japanese officials can kind of do what they want to you, and you don't really have any way to struggle against them. You're proud of who you are, but you also realize that there's problems in your culture and your civilization, and you want some change, but it's very difficult to actually undertake that change, both because the government that you're facing is so powerful, and because this whole kind of mental issue where you have to become like the people who, in a sense, are oppressing you if you want to become powerful. Now, one thing, if we want to understand why Japan is acting this way, we have to also understand what purpose Korea was serving in the Japanese Empire. Now, one thing that I think is interesting to do is compare the Empire of Japan with the American Empire, especially in the Pacific, right? During this time period, for example, the United States took control of the Philippines. It's hard to argue that if we were to lose the colony of the Philippines, that it would pose an existential threat to the United States, right? If the Americans were to lose the Philippines, it's not like someone could invade us. And that's one reason why the United States was willing to guarantee and promise and keep its promise that the Philippines would eventually become independent. Our interests were more commercial. And what strategic interests we had, we were mostly just, we wanted a base there, right? We didn't think that we had to control the whole country. So we were willing to let the Philippines go, and we did let it go. Though we did negotiate treaties that would give us the advantages we wanted. Japan's case is completely different because Japan colonized its neighbor. And I don't agree with this necessarily, but Japan's argument was because of Korea's weakness, China or Russia could have come in and taken over Korea and used that as a position from which they could threaten Japan. So Japan argues essentially it has to colonize its neighbor Korea for self-defense, right? Like I said, it's problematic because you're saying to defend myself, I have to attack my neighbor. That's highly problematic. But that's the Japanese perspective. That's why they run Korea like a military colony. That's why they appoint the military to be in charge of Korea. Because it is fundamentally for strategic reasons they're in Korea, and that's their primary concern. Secondary to that, but still very important, are economic interests. Right? They looked at Korea as a place from which they could gain natural resources, right? Particularly food. One of the major imports from Korea was rice and beans. They also wanted access to Korean markets to sell their manufactured goods. Japan did not enjoy food security. They had a hard time growing enough food, so they relied on manufacturing to use to trade for the resources they needed to survive. Finally, the Japanese population was going up, and that's a problem when you don't have enough food, and so their hope was that Korea would be a place that could absorb Japanese immigrants. Finally, it was hoped that Korea could be used to show how enlightened, how civilized Japan was, right? Japan always wanted to be a first-rate country, and this is the language they use. They didn't want to be a second-rate country, and a first-rate country should have colonies that are ruled in a civilized, that is a modern fashion. And so Japan was very interested in showing to the rest of the world, particularly the United States, that they were running Korea well, and that Korea was proof that Japan was civilized. And I have to stress, there is a connection between being civilized and being powerful, right? You want to know who's more civilized? Have two countries fight a war. Whichever wins is the more civilized country. Sounds kind of odd to us, but they equated at this time period. Civilization gives you power. And if people take you seriously as a civilized country, they're not going to mess with you. So Japan was very much, especially in that period between 1910 and 1931, very much concerned with what other people thought about Japan and about its empire. And that's a wonderful opportunity for you to write your paper. I really need to highlight Japan's international concerns. This is very important to think about when writing your paper. So, first of all, Japan in 1902 had basically entered into what amounted to an anti-Russian alliance with Great Britain. And this is really a big deal because this allowed the Japanese to not only take care of a security concern, but also say, look, we formed an alliance with Great Britain, the most powerful, greatest imperial country in the world, and one that we have tried to model our country after, right, as a kind of constitutional monarchy. And so this meant, hey, we Japanese are being taken seriously. And that was very important to the Japanese. And they wanted to maintain that good relationship with Great Britain. In addition, Japan had a complex relationship with the United States because, after all, the United States generally tended to follow a pro-British policy. It didn't mean we always got along, but there was still this kind of idea, yeah, we're all from this kind of shared English-speaking culture. And when there was, we talked about the Russo-Japanese War earlier, when the treaty was actually kind of mediated, it was by President Theodore Roosevelt. And a couple things about that. The fact that they would bring him in is interesting because, in a sense, it shows how the United States was concerned with these issues of what was going on in East Asia, right? By this time, the United States, of course, had its colony in the Philippines. and we were interested in having more influence, more especially trade in East Asia. So we were very concerned with what was going on. And we have talked earlier about how this kind of Taft-Katsura memorandum, right, where basically the United States and Japan both state their policies and their goals in the Pacific, and fortunately they line up pretty well in this time period. But the key thing is Japan is trying to expand its influence in the Pacific. The United States is trying to expand its influence in the Pacific. It's very easy for things to go off the rails, right? It's very easy for things to go into conflict, and Japan doesn't necessarily want that, especially in the 1910s and 1920s. 1930s, they don't care as much. And of course, in 1941, they attacked the United States. But especially in the 1910s, 20s, and even into the 30s, there's this concern, right? The United States is in the Pacific. We want to expand in the Pacific. We don't want to cause problems with the Americans, at least until we're ready, right? At least until we're ready. So Japan always has this kind of concern, what's going on with us in the United States, right? And we want to present a good image to the United States without having, so that we're not going to have conflict, right? And we especially don't want Americans to be criticizing us. We want to keep a good image. Good image helps bring you power. It brings you respect. Those are things we want. Now, these two images are a few years before the time period we're actually dealing with, but I think they really highlight also Japan's concerns, right? Basically, you can see on the left, there's a caption that says, "For heaven's sake, do not embarrass the administration." And you can see basically the idea is it looks like that politician is offering money to a American school child, a white American school child. And in the back, it says schoolyard, San Francisco. And you can see a Japanese mother and her son don't appear to be being allowed into the schoolyard. And you can see on the right, there's this poster that says "No Japanese in our schools." So during this time period, there is a lot of anti-Asian, especially anti-Japanese and anti-Chinese feelings, especially in the West Coast of the United States. And what happens is a lot of times Washington, D.C. wants to keep a good relationship with Japan. Just like Japan, we want to avoid too much conflict as we expand in the Pacific. But the problem is state politicians, right? They are not responsible in a sense on a world stage or to the whole country. They're responsible to the citizens in their state. And a lot of them, a lot of white Americans in particular say, well, we don't want Japanese people around. Their culture is different. They're willing to work for lower wages, and that drives down wages generally, that sort of thing. And so this causes some serious problems, because any time that Japan looks bad on a world stage, anti-Japanese forces in the United States can say, look, those Japanese people, they're barbaric, they're uncivilized, we don't want them in our country. So again, Japan is very concerned with maintaining a good public image on an international stage, because anything that makes it look bad can be used to hurt Japan, right? So if there's bad press about what Japan is doing in Korea, white Americans in particular may say, look, those Japanese, they're bad. We can't trust them. There's just something wrong with them and their culture, so we don't want them here in the United States. So that's something you have to consider if you write a paper on this subject or this era. That's why Japan is so interested in kind of making sure there's good press about it and what it's doing in Korea. And of course, this kind of anti-Asian feeling shapes what's going on with Americans and how they write. And I want to stress this goes both ways, because it's not all Americans who think this way, right? There are white Americans, like I said, this is mostly something that's happening among whites, that say, we don't want Japanese people around. There's other Americans who say, they're not doing anything wrong. They're fine. Japan's a civilized country. We need to accept Japanese immigrants. They're fine. And that's going to shape, again, that perspective. And that's why some Americans, when Japanese people don't do the best things in Korea, right, when they do bad things in Korea, that's why there are some Americans who will stand up for Japan in part, because they have a more positive image of Japan. So as we just described, Japan is very concerned with its image, and its image is related to power. And one reason, of course, it's in Korea is regarding power, especially the power needed to defend Japan, to keep Japan safe. All right, remember, Japan is primarily in Korea for strategic reasons. And one reason why Japan is going to be open up, I think, for criticism is because of the various purposes for taking Korea as its colony are going to be in contradiction, right? They're going to be conflicting with each other. So first of all, one reason Japan goes into Korea is it says, look, Koreans are not able to modernize. They are uncivilized or only half civilized. We, as fellow Asians, are the ideal group of people to go into Korea and to fix Korea, to get those Koreans to be modern, to get them to be civilized. To do that, we need to assimilate them, right? And Japan followed a policy, you'll see different terms for it, but what we would call today a policy of assimilation. We're going to make the Koreans like us Japanese, right? We Japanese are civilized Asians. Koreans are half civilized Asians or uncivilized Asians, so we need to make them like us. Now, of course, the question is, what does that mean, make them like us? How much like us do they have to be? Can they still speak Korean, right? And still and just be bilingual? Is that fine? Or should they only speak Japanese? So there's this kind of idea, right? At the same time, Japan had taken Korea in part as an outlet for its population. And so Japan is going to treat Korea like a settler colony, right? Large numbers of Japanese people are going to move to Korea with the idea that they and their children and their children's children will live in Korea. Right, so we're going to have a large number of Japanese people leaving Japan to move to Korea, looking for economic opportunity and looking for a place to settle and live out their lives, planning to do so for generations, right? They're not going there to make some money and then go back to Japan. They're going there to stay in Korea. And a very large population of Japanese people will end up living in Korea. Something I think like one out of every 20 people in the peninsula will be Japanese. There's a huge number of Japanese people there. And of course, those Japanese people say, look, we're in Korea for our own benefit. We don't really care that much about the Koreans. We're here for our own benefit. And these issues, this leads to tensions because on one side, Japan promises, we're going to make you Koreans modernized. We're going to make you civilized. We're going to improve your lives. But this promise to make lives better for the Koreans is often sacrificed for the good of the Japanese settlers in Korea. So you can especially see this in education policy, right? It makes a lot of sense. How are we going to civilize Koreans? We're going to educate them. We're going to teach them the skills and the morality and the discipline necessary to become modern. And I want to point out, a lot of Koreans were supportive of the expansion of education, right? They wanted more education and education that would make their nation strong and help them to prosper as individuals, as families, and so forth. However, the Japanese people who were living in Korea said, well, that's fine, but we need to prioritize our children's education first, and we don't want those Koreans competing with our kids. So we don't want those Koreans to have as good of an education as Japanese people have. It's fine if you want to train those Koreans in Japanese so that they can work in factories and things for us as managers, right? So you can see this kind of tension, right? Okay, we need to assimilate Koreans. We need to educate them. We need to civilize them. That's great. We'll give them an education. But we want to make sure that they don't become so much like us that they threaten our position as Japanese, right? We don't want them to become too much like us. We want them to become like us enough that they can serve us and our empire well, but we don't want them to become too Japanese because then they would be able to compete with us successfully for jobs and things like that. So the key thing is here that I want to stress, there are inherent contradictions in what Japan is trying to do in Korea. It's trying to do a whole bunch of different things. These things contradict. And it really is upsetting to a lot of Koreans, right? Even Koreans who want to support the empire are frustrated because Japan is never really interested in treating them like equals, even though it demands they become like the Japanese. And remember, we have missionaries in Korea, right? There are still American missionaries in Korea. Most of them in this time period are Protestants. Typically, the Catholic missionaries were French or German, so that's why we don't deal a lot with Catholics, even though that's my specialty, is Catholicism in Korea. Now, a lot of times they did what you would expect missionaries to do, and that's try and convert people to Christianity. And one thing that I think is fascinating is looking at missionary literature. And one example is this book called The Happiest Girl in Korea and Other Stories from the Land of the Morning Calm. And this is basically a book about Korean children for American children to read. And I think that would make a fascinating project. And it's looking at mostly from a missionary perspective, but you could deal with issues of gender and things like that as well. And then here you have another example. A pioneering missionary in Korea was a guy named Henry Appenzeller. And there's a book about him called A Modern Pioneer in Korea. And this was actually released during the colonial period. So there are some, if you are just interested in missionaries and what they're doing in Korea, you can look at something like this. Now, one thing that's important, missionaries initially were mostly pro-Japan. They saw that Korea was having a lot of problems, that even if they maybe were respectful and had a deep affection for Korean people, they said, look, the system of the Korean government is bad, it's corrupt, it's problematic. Japan, on the other hand, has done a good job of building a modern government. We want peace and order. The Japanese, I think, can give it, so let's support the Japanese. And so initially, most Protestant missionaries in Korea were either actively or passively pro-Japanese. Very few were actually going to criticize or resist the Japanese. After all, they didn't come to Korea in order to try and win Korean independence. They came to Korea in order to spread the gospel, right? So that was their major interest. And at first, it seemed like the Japanese would be good at making a conducive environment, right? The Japanese early on didn't want to alienate the missionaries, most of whom were Americans, and the ones who weren't Americans usually were part of the British Empire. They were usually Australian, British, or Canadian. So the Japanese actively courted American missionaries in the before annexation, and even during the first years of annexation, tried to encourage the American missionaries to be pro-Japanese, and most were actively or passively. However, as Japanese rule continued, more and more American missionaries became increasingly sympathetic to the Koreans, right? They became increasingly sympathetic towards Koreans because they saw the contradictions in Japan's policy, right? Japan was supposed to be coming in to enlighten Koreans, to build schools, to help make them more modern, but it seemed like the Japanese were just enriching themselves. And you have these police officers running around beating up people, right? And if you're a pastor in Korea, you feel for your Korean people who are getting oppressed by the Japanese. So increasingly, American missionaries are going to become critical of the Japanese government. That doesn't mean they're pro-Korean independence, but they are upset about how the Japanese government is treating Koreans. And that's really a big deal because, of course, those American missionaries share what happens in in Japanese-controlled Korea. They share what happens there with Americans back in the United States. And all it takes is for an American missionary to write a letter back to the mission board, or for that mission board to share that with people in their church, and for those people to start writing the American Congress or to start publishing article or letters to the editor in newspapers and things like that to create diplomatic incidents. Right, so this is very important for us to understand. Koreans are often upset about a lot of things that are going on in Korea. They have contacts with Americans in Korean, these missionaries, right? And the missionaries are often very sympathetic to the Koreans and are willing to share what's going on with to them, what's being done to them, with the rest of the world.